In this video, I wanted to discuss in very layman terms how the autistic brain looks like, how it differs from a neurotypical person, what's the differences are at a biological level. We won't get into very technical details, so should be easy enough to follow, although of course there will be some basic neurobiology here. And more importantly, how this relates to the actual experience of the autistic person from the inside and how it affects their perspective and behavior. So when it comes to the brain, we just, for everyone to have a basic base level understanding of what we're talking about. So primarily, let's say the brain is made of neurons, so these brain cells, and which are connected together with a set of synapses, connections between different neural cells. And what creates the manifestation of intelligence is actually, it's not any specific cell. There was this old ancient theory about this grandma neuron, actually, it's the idea that every specific neuron activates one specific things. It was an old theory in the 70s. So there will be like and this was based on some research, because there was I think some researchers who have done managed to show that the specific neurons activate when shown a specific stimuli. So this was whole idea of the grandma neuron. So like everything, including your grandma, will have a specific set of neurons which activates and generate your response to your grandma, and the behavioral, cognitive, emotional responses to that specific stimuli. Now, the way it actually works is that all the behavior, this is shown also very well about the phenomenon of neuroplasticity. So if you have, say, you lose a sight or something like that, you can reuse other part of the brain to reuse other senses. The same part of the brain is readapted to, say, gain vision through some other tool or the other things. I discussed this in my book, The Subtle Evil Demon. So I won't go into details, but that's kind of the way it works. So it's the pattern of connection which generates the behavior. So it considers this as a net of little dots that are connected one with another, which activates based on different stimuli. Different dots activate more or less, enhancing or inhibiting certain behaviors. So you'll have that, okay, certain stimuli activates certain memories, certain triggers, certain emotional responses, certain behaviors, and this is all different sets of neurons which are connected. So it is this connection, this bond of, if this neuron fires up, this other fires up too. So the way it works is, once you have kind of trained your brain to fire neurons in a certain sequence, then you go to repeat that pattern. So you have, okay, say a stimuli, it could be a childhood memory. Say, for instance, it will activate the memory, it will activate an emotion, it will activate maybe certain physiological responses, it will activate certain behavior, it will activate certain verbal expression and things of that sort. So the key concept to understand when it comes to autism is a phenomena called synaptic pruning in general. So, and many people don't know that unless they have a background in neurobiology. And the thing is, actually, when we grow up, we kind of lose a lot of brain cells, and most importantly, a lot of connections between brain cells. And this is a little bit counterintuitive, because we think of growth as something that's progressive, and this is particularly true for this a branch of mainstream psychology which is very focused on the effect of the environment, and they believe in this sort of nature versus nurture debate. They believe that this old school thought of psychology where you are basically the response of the experiences you had. There is a small to negligible impact of your genetics, your inner inner nature, your innate nature, and most of what happens is an effect of what your environment has been, what you have been taught by your parents, by your peers, by society, by culture. And this is actually a very political way of thinking. This is a political playground actually, because it's about um, basically having certain groups of having power to do things in a certain way, and it's competition over that. That's the whole history of culture in that regard. But I discussed that in different videos and books. But basically the way it really works is that there are psychological and biological processes going there. Of course, the environment has an effect, but there is some pre-planned things that are going to happen in the brain, and this is very well shown by, for instance, the fact that um, culture has very, very, very little effect on certain behaviors, even when there is very remarkable difference. So one I mention always is, for instance, usage of alcohol, and you will see that there are some countries where, like Italy, where drinking alcohol, wine during meals is like the most obvious things everybody kind of does, and you will have some countries like Muslim countries where alcohol is strictly forbidden by the Quran, and you will see that actual difference in the behavior in how much people actually drink is not really that big. And the biggest example of all is obviously sexuality, with say it doesn't really matter what sort of culture you have in sexual behavior is really, 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 really similar. And in fact, this is kind of remarkable because you have a lot of differences, cultural differences, in what is considered to be appropriate sexual behavior. It's purely cultural in a sense. So you have, for instance, homosexuality will be like severely repressed in some countries, up to the death penalty, and so it is the very massive deterrent of against doing anything of that sort. And you have some countries in which, well, maybe not entirely well accepted in any country, but still, there are nowadays countries where it's gay rights are heavily emphasized, at least by certain political parties, and we have same sex unions and things like that. So there is a remarkable cultural difference there. And what you see is that the actual prevalence of homosexuality is pretty much arguably being the same across history, regardless of how openly accepted it is, compared to punished up to the death penalty. It doesn't really make that much difference. So there are biological processes there which go on, and are really oftentimes very much independent of what the environment is. And of course, the environment does has an impact. It does influences the brain. We are learning beings, so it's not nature or nurture. It's just that the part of nurture is typically overemphasized for cultural historical reason by certain psychologists. So what is this? What's the problem here? The idea with the nurture is that we are blank slates mostly, or entirely, and so this accumulation of new information, new knowledge, new experiences is what shapes our brain. So you'll have that, as a child, you're kind of this blank slate, nothing much is molded there, and over time, over experience, through learning, you shape more and more things, more behavioral responses, more verbal expressions, more emotional responses, more behavioral actions, and so on. So you keep, building and building and building until you have this adult brain, which is, kind of this who you all have become, this accumulation of input that you have through your lifetime. Now, one important thing, very important process that happens during childhood is called pruning. So what happens is that up until then, you have been forming brain cells and connection between these brain cells. So this synapses, this connection between different brain cells. And what happens is that through your childhood you actually lose most of them. Most of them die off. This is called pruning because it's exactly what when you cut a tree to let only certain things to grow. That's kind of the same thing. So you cut off a lot of things in order to focus fully on certain things. Let's put it like that. And this is very relevant for the autistic experience. I did mention this in the video, a metaphor for autism, native speakers versus polyglots, and I made this argument that autistic people have more varied perception and cognition and emotion, and so they're more sensitive to all sorts of different things, as opposed to being set into a certain way of being and acting and thinking. So why does this make sense at a biological level is that it has been shown that this phenomena of pruning is reduced in autism. So if you take an autistic individual as opposed to a neurotypical person, the neurotypical person, once they go through their childhood, they nearly half of actually brain cells and brain connection you had as a child is in typical development dies off. So, and this could be actually part of why we experience childhood amnesia. Most of us don't really remember what happened to us before 5, 6 years of age. It's more or less that's more or less the time frame. So when you think of your very first autobiographical memory, it's probably something that happens. It could be some occasional glimpse of something at 2 or 3, but for most people it will be typically like 5, 6, and that's when you start remembering your life story basically. So if you think of your life experiences, your childhood, most of what you remember is things from the age of 5 or 6. The things below age 5 or 6, with few exceptions or few occasional events, is probably something that you don't have amnesia of, and it's called childhood amnesia, and it could be related to the fact that most of your brain cells and brain connection have been cut off at that point, and so it's kind of a stage where you set up your brain onto what is going to be cut off, and then you focus entirely on that. So the way this works is you always make the example of language, because it's very fitting. So again, see the native speaker versus polyglot video for more info. But the way it works is there are all sorts of different sounds and inputs which as a child you are sensitive to. That's why a child can learn any language they are in. It doesn't matter if you're born to Chinese parents, to Italian parents, to British parents. If you live in England, you're going to learn English. If you live in Italy, you're going to learn Italian. If you're going to live in China, you're going to learn Chinese. And so genetics doesn't matter in this regard. You will entirely adapt to that specific linguistic pattern as a child. As an adult, you cannot do that. If you have ever learned to try to learn a language as an adult, you know that one of the problems you're going to have is that you can't really hear the difference between certain sounds, which is obvious to the native speakers. So, for instance, in Italian, I teach Italian in Finland, for instance, and one of the things that they can just entirely not get their head around is that in Italy we have two different E's and two different O's. So we have E and E, and we have O and O. And they're achieved by putting the tongue either more on the front or on the back, and they're different sounds. Sometimes they using one or another changes the meaning of the word, and that's something that in Finnish doesn't happen. So for me, it's entirely natural. I hear the difference very well. For them, it's like hearing the exact same thing. They don't see the difference. So this is what pruning does in a way. It doesn't let you see the difference. And what's the benefit in that? Why would we do that? Why would nature set up us in a way that we lose most of our brain and we lose most of our brain connection? The thing is, we um, we become more fast and proficient at doing one specific things as opposed to have more divergent generalized um, uh, patterns of perception, let's put it like that. Now, if you compare the autistic individual with the neurotypical individual at the neurological level, what you see is exactly that. More brain cells in autistic people, more synaptic connections, less synaptic pruning as they grow up, and a more stronger localized connection. So you will see that you will have certain very strong connection in certain parts of the brain at very localized circuits. So you will have patterns of thinkings and behavior which are not these not so generalized, but some very specific, a very powerful connection on certain specific things. And this relates, it describes very well at the biological level what the autistic experience is like. So if the thing, and this is actually mostly about the sensory, motor, and perception, cognition, and emotional aspect of autism, not so much on the social, that are going to have to discuss in different things. And we don't have that much evidence describing the social atypicality of autism at the neurobiological level, although there is some degree of evidence, but that's kind of what I want to keep for another. But at the level of perception, autistic people have are divergent. They are peculiar in the way they think, they feel, and experience things. So cognitive, emotional, sensory, motor peculiarity. Let's put it like that. And the theories explaining this, for instance, a monotropic theory, which posits that autistic people go into very strong attention tunnels, and their attention is monopolized by certain things. It makes perfect sense at the biological level because you have this, as we say, more localized, generalized connections. Now, the atypicality in the perception that they could be either hyper or hyposensitive to things. Again, it makes perfect sense because you often have autistic people. The common assumption will be like, they are very focused on details and they may notice things which other people don't, which is exactly this same thing. You'll have autistic people being able to see patterns and details and notice things in stuff which neurotypical will just ignore. And this is the effect of lesser synaptic pruning. It's just exactly like the Finnish person doesn't hear the difference between e and a because it's not relevant to their language. So the brain just learns to ignore it. I have actually my course on the psychology of belief and ideology, which explains this, how a lot of how our brain works is by filtering out information. So what neurotypical does very effectively is filter out most of information unless it is relevant to some specific, most typically social reason. And autistic people don't do that, so they are not as good as neurotypicals as filtering out everything that is deemed irrelevant by what is normal, and so they have this both ability and or disability, depending on what you see, to notice things that other people don't. Be attentive to things that other people don't see. Be focused on things and have these very strong interests about something, very extremely passionate about some specific things which neurotypicals can't follow. And that's because you have these more stronger and more intense and more peculiar connections which are not formed, either not formed or deliberately die off in neurotypical development. So this is kind of, I think there is a good, I think this is a good thing, because when we look at things from a biological level, okay, how does the autistic brain looks like, and we are going to look at reasonable theories, psychological theories of autism. I'm not going into the weird ones like the extreme male brain theory from Baron Cohen, Simon Baron Cohen, or the medical perspective of autism. We just pathologize them as, being disabled and dysfunctional, and don't see why the brain works in a certain way, and it's just about, making a list of why these people are also less than the normal population, basically. But if you go to the reasonable one, so as I mentioned, monotropic theory, okay, why do we see autistic people being these monopolizing their attention on certain things, and hyper focusing on these attention tunnels, and becoming hyper enthusiastic, and why they, seem to just or this intense world enhanced perceptual functioning theory, which posits that autistic people have this enhanced perception, and then that's why they get so passionate, so emotional, so focused on certain things. Why you have this divergence of typicality, so you will have hyper or hypo sensitivity to things, hyper focusing or hypo focusing on certain things. So how does it make sense at a brain level? And it does makes perfect sense, because you have that neurotypical person is supposed to be able to ignore most of the information that's out there, and focus on a specialized, strict way of performing, which is going to be very functional, because then you're going to be very fast and very effective on doing that specific thing. So you will have that, if you can ignore everything else, you will be very good at doing what everybody else is doing, and then how you become, very fitting in. You are not diverse in any way. You are not the misfit. You are not a weirdo. You can just ignore everything else that's out there, and say things, do things in the manner that everybody else is doing, hold eye contact in the right way, say the right words, express the feelings in the proper way. So there is this proper, very scripted, very rigid way in which neurotypical society works, which, if you ignore everything else, it's easy to fit in. Now, oftentimes, it's for autistic people, we are often, and I will make another video about this, we are often described as just not getting it, being unable to see certain things. And I'd argue, and it's definitely the thing for me, it's not being unable to see, it's just that you don't see only that, you also see all sort of different other options. And again, see the video native speaker versus polyglot on what's the challenging that this cause. Even myself, as I said, I teach Italian in Finland, and I normally think and speak in English. So it is juggling between all of these creates sometimes a little bit of a slow response and a bit of confusion, because there is many different options, many different possible pathways in the brain that you have to activate, instead of speaking just one language. So whenever you hear a word, it's that word. You don't have to think, oh wait, is this person talking English, is this person talking Finnish, is this person talking Italian. So for the autistic person, you have these more brain cells, more brain connections, more synaptic connections, more specialized, intense, strong local connection, which means you can focus on a lot of things, get a lot of interest on a lot of things, which for the neurotypical people is kind of like not there. So you will be the person, it's not necessarily the fact that you don't see what other people are doing. And in fact, most autistic people are masking, so which means they do see what neurotypical people are doing, and they try to imitate it for the sake of not being bullied or rejected or things like that. So it's not like we have various degrees of how skilled we can be at that, but that's a different kind of conversation. But often it's not the point that, okay, you don't see that. It's more like, okay, I see that, but I see a lot of other things, and oftentimes these other things are very interesting, so I get distracted by these other things, and I cannot focus purely on just being normal and acting the same way as everybody else does, focusing on what everybody else is focusing on, because maybe oftentimes there is these I haven't cut off these brain connections, and there is something that my brain is keen on to picking, and which feels very interesting for me, and I have these very strong localized connections that makes create a very strong behavioral or emotional or intellectual response to certain things. And in fact, most of my experience with masking is that it's always having this, oh, there is something I'm so excited about and so interested, put it back, it's not normal, focus on doing what everybody else is doing. And so yeah, it's just that you have all this sort of very rich, very powerful inner experience, which tends to monopolize your attention and captivates you, because you don't have the ability, or it's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, I do like the way my brain works, but of course that's a matter of subjective experience, and a lot of people don't happen to be a fan of the way my brain works. I have get that from my life, and that it would be better if it didn't, and that it's a disability to work like that. But it's that's kind of the way it is, both of a personal experience and from the perspective of the neurobiology of it. So you have so what happens in my brain is basically there are a lot of things which feels I want to do, and I feel so passionate about of, and I feel so enthusiastic about doing or sharing with people or doing for people. And it's like, if when you're neurotypical, you're normal, these patterns of synaptic connections are not supposed to activate you, it's not supposed to be there. And this is also what the experience of masking is. It's just like I feel there is a lot inside of me, and what makes it painful is exactly this. It's just that this inner experience is expected to be constantly hidden, so you feel most of what you experience, most of what you feel, most of what you think is just something that you have to hide off to fit in, and to pass as a neurotypical person, which feels very crippling at an emotional level. And so yeah, it's, you have this there's just a lot of things going on, which explains why autistic people tend to be more divergent, filter out things in a different ways. Some IT companies or some certain companies do kind of have this practice now of having training and leveraging so-called autistic traits, because it's useful in certain settings to have the ability to filter out informations in different things, to pay attention to details which the neurotypicals want, to see things which other people are not seeing, to see patterns which most other people are not noticing. But this comes with the cost of not being able to perform flawlessly a very specific ritual, say, the way the neurotypical person will do. So it will be difficult for us to have this ability to, like neurotypical, just know what's expected to say, just what's expected to do, how we are expected to look, where we're supposed to how long are you supposed to hold your handshake, what's the time you are supposed to touch somebody on the shoulder, when it's the time to hold eye contact, when it's the right word to say in this context, and it is all very script, very rigid, very specific way. What we often also know, did you lose the memo, or autistic people saying you don't take this sort of rule book that everybody else is following, and you have not been given. And that's kind of because your brain has not been specialized in the way the neurotypical brain is, into something that's okay, ignore everything else and just focus on that. And this is exactly what we see when we analyze the thing at the neurobiological level, looking at the differences inside the brain.